Hello and welcome to our webinar, hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Community Development Studies and Education Department. Our topic today is Bridging the Gap, Research and Practice on Gentrification and Equitable Development in Philadelphia. I'm Jean Rourke from the Federal Reserve, and I'll be your facilitator. Let me be the first to introduce and thank our presenters for today's call. They are Eileen DeVerney. Eileen is a research analyst from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Nora Lichtosh, who is executive director from the Women's Community Revitalization Project. And from the Local Initiative Support Corporation of Philadelphia, we have executive director Andy Frischkopf. If you've joined us in the webinar, we're going to jump to slide 2 to cover some call logistics. You may have noticed that the webinar tool offered the option to listen to the audio through your PC speakers or over the phone. The quality of the PC audio does depend on your connection, so at any time, feel free to dial into the bridge number. And if you'd like to see the slides a bit larger, click on the small gray box at the top right of the slide window. This will maximize the slide for you. Okay, this call is being recorded, and the archive will be available in the next few days. It'll be posted to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia's Community Development Studies page in the coming days. Okay, you can ask questions during today's session. Our speakers will take questions after our content is presented. But at any time during our session, you can type your questions into the chat window using that Ask Question button on your screen. All right, I'm going to move to slide 3, where you'll see some legal language. There we go. You should see slide 3 now. But I'm also going to launch our very first polling question. So if you've joined us in the webinar, grab your mouse and join in on the fun. All right, the question is, do you or your organization currently work in a neighborhood considered to be gentrifying? You have 2 options. There's yes and there's no. So I'm going to let you think about that question that has been posed. So grab that mouse and make your selection when you feel like you're ready. And the legal language for our call today, the views expressed here are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So I probably stalled long enough to allow you to answer that first polling question. We'll have a couple more throughout our session. And it looks like our results are 73% of our participants say yes and 27% say no. I'm going to stop that poll, and I'm going to take us back to slide 4, and I'll turn it over to Eileen.
Thanks, Jean. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we'll be having, since so many of you work in neighborhoods that are part of this. So thank you all for joining us on the call today. Today I'm going to present some very recently released research on gentrification and residential mobility patterns in Philadelphia. The research might be in your inbox right now. We just sent it out this morning. And the goal is to provide you with an overview of the city-level findings from the research to provide context for our conversation today. And then when I'm done, I will turn things over to Nora and Andy, who are going to talk about their experiences working on the ground in these communities and share some of their insights from the equitable development strategies that they've been working on. So moving to slide number 5. As I mentioned, we just recently released the research today. We released it in 2 formats. The first is a discussion paper, which is more technical, definitely gets into the research nitty-gritty, and is probably most appropriate for an academic or research audience. And then the other format is a shorter, easier to read kind of practitioner summary that's geared to being more accessible to a broader community development audience. So moving to slide number 6. Before I jump into the findings from the webinar, I want to give a little bit of background on the motivation for this research and what knowledge gaps we were really hoping to fill. I think probably anyone who lives in Philadelphia who's on the webinar today is familiar with the public discussion around gentrification and the implications it has for a city that has very profound social and economic disparities, as well as a number of neighborhoods that have been distressed for quite a long time. So some of the research questions that we were hoping to answer include which Philadelphia neighborhoods are gentrifying, who's moving into these gentrifying neighborhoods and who is moving out, where do vulnerable residents who leave gentrifying neighborhoods move, And how does gentrification affect the financial health of neighborhood residents, with financial health being a sort of proxy for broader economic well-being? So moving to slide number 7, there were 2 data sets that we used to approach these questions. First, we looked at census variables, changes at the tract level between 2000 and 2013 to identify our gentrifying neighborhoods. And I'll provide a little more detail on that in just a moment. And then to look at mobility patterns, we looked at an anonymized random 5% sample of everybody in the U.S. who has both a Social Security number and a credit report. And this allowed us to see where movers moved over time, because as those individuals updated their address with their credit card company or their auto loan servicer or any company that they have some sort of debt product with, that company then reports that to Equifax, and Equifax updates the census block in which their address is located in our data set. So in addition to being able to see where these individuals live over time, we also have information on certain characteristics like their debt use, their Equifax risk score, which is the same, essentially the same as their credit score, and age. However, we do not have access to some variables that might have been of interest to this research. So we don't know the individual's race or ethnicity, we don't know their income, and we don't know for sure whether or not they rent or own their home, though we have some proxy variables for that. And lastly, before we move on from this slide, an important caveat is that, as I mentioned, this data set includes only individuals with both a Social Security number and a credit report. So we might be missing some recent immigrants, as well as people who do not use or do not have access to conventional credit products, and that's a limitation that we acknowledge. So moving to slide number 8, this is the process we use to identify gentrifying neighborhoods. So a neighborhood was considered gentrifiable if its median income was below that of the city as a whole in 2000. Of those cities that were eligible to gentrify, the ones that we considered gentrifying were ones that saw an above-average increase in housing costs and an above-average increase in the share of their residents who were college-educated between 2000 and 2013. Additionally, we applied the same methodology to historic data to identify tracts that had gentrified prior to our study period. So moving to slide number 8, in addition to these categories, we further categorized the gentrifying neighborhoods into different categories. Could we move to slide 9? Sorry. We further categorized the gentrifying neighborhoods based on the speed and intensity of gentrification and the implications that had for the relative affordability in terms of the city as a whole. So intense gentrification neighborhoods became among the most expensive neighborhoods in the city during the gentrification period, whereas weak gentrification neighborhoods remained fairly affordable, even though they did gentrify and they did see housing costs increase. Additionally, we grouped all of the neighborhoods that had begun gentrifying prior to the study period into their own category, with the logic being that those are in more advanced stages of gentrification. So moving to slide 10, we also grouped together the neighborhoods into neighborhood clusters, primarily by geographic proximity, but also by similarity in economic and in some cases demographic characteristics. And we provide analyses at this neighborhood cluster level in the practitioner summary that I mentioned earlier. All right, so moving to slide number 11. We can start talking about some of the residential mobility questions around gentrification. So once we identified which neighborhoods were gentrifying, we had kind of 3 sets of neighborhoods. So we had those neighborhoods that were gentrifying. We had the low-income neighborhoods that did not gentrify. And then we had the set of neighborhoods whose median incomes were too high to be considered gentrifiable. So those are our non-gentrifiable neighborhoods. And as you can see on the chart here on slide 11, the mobility rate for residents of gentrifying neighborhoods was consistently higher for almost all of the years in our study period. And this was primarily driven by the exceptionally high mobility rates in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods, as well as neighborhoods that were in more advanced stages of gentrification. So moving to slide 12, so we did see this difference in the aggregate. Actually, when you look at the mobility rates for financially vulnerable movers, who we defined as having fairly low credit scores or no credit score, the mobility rates are actually much more similar, particularly between the gentrifying neighborhoods and the low-income, non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And with the exception of the couple kind of housing boom years leading up to the foreclosure crisis, you can see that they actually track pretty closely. And in fact, when we controlled for individual household and neighborhood characteristics, we did not find a statistically significant difference between the mobility rates for vulnerable folks in gentrifying neighborhoods versus vulnerable folks in non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And while that may seem somewhat counterintuitive at first, we think there's a few things that might be at play here. So the first is that involuntary moves resulting from financial instability, eviction, or foreclosure may already be fairly common in low-income neighborhoods, even those that do not gentrify. And the other is that vulnerable residents may be more inclined to stay in gentrifying neighborhoods if they see neighborhood conditions improving. So while some might have their mobility rate increased because they actually cannot afford to stay in the neighborhood, others who are more able to absorb those kind of cost of living increases may be more inclined to. And so with those two trends kind of pushing the mobility rates in opposite directions, what you end up with is a mobility rate for vulnerable folks in gentrifying neighborhoods that isn't all that different from that of similar residents of non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So moving to slide 13. With that being said, even though we did not see a higher mobility rate, what we did find is that low-score, financially vulnerable individuals were much less likely to move into gentrifying neighborhoods. And so we have the non-gentrifying low-income neighborhoods here in dark blue, and the gentrifying neighborhoods there in the kind of orangish yellow. And so the solid line represents the share of neighborhood residents who were low score and moved out of the neighborhood, and the dashed line represents the share of residents who were low score and moved into the neighborhood. And as you can see, for the gentrifying neighborhoods, in all years other than 2009, which was a fairly exceptional year, the share of low score outmovers was higher than the share of those the share of low score in movers, suggesting that more low score outmovers moved out each year than moved in. And this is likely because part of the gentrification process was the dramatic increase in housing costs. And so for these economically disadvantaged folks, those neighborhoods that previously they had been able to move into were no longer affordable to them, and so they could no longer move in. So moving to slide 14. Because of this kind of largely driven by this change in who is able to move into gentrifying neighborhoods, you see a decline in the share of neighborhood residents who are in this financially vulnerable category over time. And moving to slide 15. So kind of the big question around all of this is what does this mean in terms of displacement? So based on these results, while we did not find significant evidence that gentrification increases the direct displacement of vulnerable residents, we did find significant evidence that the indirect displacement of vulnerable residents occurred because these neighborhoods became less accessible to vulnerable populations over time. And these findings are actually consistent with other recent studies that have looked at similar questions using kind of different methods. However, these studies, for the most part, have not been able to look at where people moved. And so before I move into that section, I'm going to pass things back to Jean for our next polling question.
Great, thanks, Eileen. Okay, so grab your mouse if you've joined us in the webinar, and a polling question should pop up on your screen very shortly, and I'll read that aloud for our group. All right, it popped up on my screen, so I'm going to go ahead and read that aloud along with your options. Where do you think the majority of financially vulnerable movers from gentrifying neighborhoods moved? Let me say that again. Where do you think the majority of financially vulnerable movers from gentrifying neighborhoods moved? So your options are A, to another neighborhood in a gentrifying neighborhood cluster, B, elsewhere within the city, or C, out of the city. So I'm going to give you just a couple of seconds to consider your options and make your selection on that screen. All right, I think I've paused long enough. I'm going to go ahead and stop that poll and show the results. And those results should be popping up on your screen in just one second. And Eileen, it looks like 68% of your participants said elsewhere within the city. So I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, so moving to slide 16, we can see what we found in our analysis. I will say that it sounds like our participants have a pretty good instinct in this regard. So slide 16. We looked at where individuals who were exiting gentrifying neighborhoods moved to by risk score group. And as many of you guessed, many of the lower score financially vulnerable residents were dispersed within the city, whereas those who had higher credit scores, particularly in the highest credit score group, were much more likely to exit the city entirely. And moving to slide 17, you can really see that pattern kind of borne out in the maps here. That will be on that slide. There it is. And so on the left here, you can see that the high credit score movers were largely moving to Center City, to near-in parts of West Philadelphia and South Philadelphia, or to the suburbs more broadly. Whereas looking at the low score movers on the right there, you can see that they were much more dispersed throughout the city. Many of them moved to low-income neighborhoods that did not gentrify during this period. And you can really see how the indirect displacement that we observed kind of ultimately contributes to the redistribution of vulnerable residents to more distressed parts of the city. So moving to slide 18. These patterns of mobility that we see mapped there are consistent with what we saw in terms of the risk of downward mobility for movers. So movers moving from gentrifying neighborhoods to neighborhoods that were were considerably lower income. And we found that the risk of moving to a lower income neighborhood was particularly high for individuals from certain vulnerable groups who moved out of gentrifying neighborhoods. And those groups were individuals with low credit scores, so our financially vulnerable folks, individuals who were likely to be renters, as indicated by the absence of a mortgage on their credit report, and as well as long-term residents, individuals who had lived in that tract for 5+ years. They were at a higher risk of moving to a neighborhood that was economically less well off. And so moving to slide 19, we also compared the neighborhoods that movers moved from, so the gentrifying neighborhoods that they moved from to where they moved to based on a set of quality of life indicators. So this looks at the performance of neighborhood public elementary schools in the origin and destination neighborhoods of movers from gentrifying neighborhoods. And you can see that for movers overall, on average, they were able to move to school districts, to schools, areas with neighborhood elementary schools that were slightly higher performing. But focusing in on low score movers, you can see that they started out in neighborhoods that had somewhat lower performing schools, and they saw less of an improvement when they moved. And actually, low score movers who moved within the city actually saw a slight but statistically significant decline in school quality in their destination neighborhoods. So moving to slide 20, we also looked at the neighborhood rate of violent crime and saw a somewhat similar pattern. So movers overall were able to, on average, move to neighborhoods with considerably lower rates of violent crime, whereas low-score movers who started in neighborhoods that had already somewhat higher violent crime rates saw less of a reduction. And actually, low-score movers who moved within the city ended up moving to neighborhoods with equally high rates of violent crime. And on these and other indicators that we looked at, outcomes were consistently the worst for low-score movers moving from rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods and neighborhoods that were in more advanced stages of gentrification. Those movers were much more likely to move to neighborhoods with significantly worse school performance or with higher violent crime rates. So moving to slide 21. Slide 21 looks at our findings from the financial health analysis, which was a little bit more of a mixed bag. So although staying in a gentrifying neighborhood was associated with more of an improvement in an individual's risk score than staying in a neighborhood that was not gentrifying, the improvement was less than expected for low-score movers, low-score individuals who stayed in the neighborhood, and it was higher than expected for high-score movers who stayed in the neighborhood. So moving to slide 22, which is my summary slide. Essentially, the key findings from the report were that even though vulnerable residents were not necessarily more likely to move out of gentrifying neighborhoods compared to non-gentrifying neighborhoods, we did find that they were significantly less likely to be able to move into those neighborhoods. Additionally, vulnerable residents who did exit gentrifying neighborhoods faced a greater risk of moving to a neighborhood that was economically worse off and had worse performance on quality of life indicators. And that was particularly the case if they were moving within Philadelphia. And additionally, the financial health benefits of living in gentrifying neighborhoods was diminished somewhat for low-score, more financially vulnerable residents. And so overall, our findings paint kind of a nuanced picture of gentrification, but there are some clear equitable development challenges that they point to. So primarily, how gentrification affects which neighborhoods are affordable to economically disadvantaged folks to be able to move into. And then also our observed pattern of the redistribution of existing economically vulnerable folks in gentrifying neighborhoods to neighborhoods that offer less opportunity throughout the city. And so moving to slide 23, I'm going to wrap up and pass things off to Nora, and I look forward to our conversation.
Great, thanks, Eileen. I'm really glad to be here, partly because this research is so important and also because it connects so strongly to the work of the Women's Community Revitalization Project where I work, and we also call our organization WCRP for short. And about a year ago, the Women's Community Revitalization Project, WCRP, helped to convene a coalition called Philadelphia Coalition for Affordable Communities. And that coalition is working on an effort to enact policy, push policy that will help curb displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods. And I just want to state a caveat first that WCRP is pro-development. We know our city can only get stronger and thrive if there's new market rate development. But we also want to make sure that there's policy in place that protects folks who've invested in neighborhoods over the long term, including low and moderate income families and business owners. And before I talk about these policy efforts, I just need to take a step back so you'll understand the roots of this work, which are in our neighborhood in North Philly. Next slide, please. So WCRP was founded almost 30 years ago with a two-part mission. And the first part is building buildings. And for us, that's primarily been affordable residential development. We've developed and managed 250 townhomes and currently have another 36 in construction. But equally important is the other part of our mission, which is building the leadership of all of us who are part of this work. And for us, that leadership development grows out of our efforts to shift policy and resource decisions. We identify issues in our community by listening to folks. And all of us who live, work, or worship in a neighborhood know what's going on there. So we've come to see that it's important to voice those stories that describe those issues. But our insights and our stories become even more powerful when we can say, this is what's going on for me, but here's the data that proves it's true for many others. So we've been linking up with researchers to help us get that data. And then in addition to telling our stories in conjunction with data, we also feel we have the responsibility to identify solutions. And sometimes those solutions are neighborhood-based, but often other communities are experiencing just the same things. And that's when we need to work citywide and bring groups together to build our voice and our power. So you could go to the next slide, please. The next slide shows WCRP's kind of core boundaries where we've done most of our housing work. So you see that little red square is the map of Philly. That's where we exist. And those are our boundaries, Girard to Diamond, Front to 10th for a lot of our work. And the next slide shows when those researchers mapped the vacancy in our neighborhood, which is something all of us knew. There was too much vacant and blighted land in our neighborhood. But when it was mapped, you can see every single thing on that map that's black is a vacant building, and every single thing that's kind of grayish, greenish is a vacant lot. And that was as of 2009 when we did this work. So that was fully 1 out of every 4 addresses is vacancy. It was really a big problem in our neighborhood. The next problem is on the next slide, where we wanted to look at market pressure. So yes, so the next slide shows on the top, south of our neighborhood is Northern Liberties, and those are 2 shots of the piazza pre-construction and post-construction. And then west of us is Temple, so there's all the student housing, and east of us is Fishtown, which was formerly a working-class white ethnic neighborhood, but has gotten very expensive. So on the next slide, we wanted to quantify the market pressure. And so our researchers mapped the location and scale on the next slide. The location and scale of market rate development. So everything that's blue bluish gray is either market rate development that was developed or was planned when we were looking at this as of 2009. And the yellow is the affordable housing that was built, and there's a little bit that's planned. But when you look at this in relation to our neighborhood, it's really stark. And on the next slide, you can see there's two of the same maps, and it's the real estate transaction that occurred. On the map on the left, it's the real estate transactions that occurred between 2001 and 2002, and everything in navy blue was a transaction that occurred for $40,000 or less. And then 6 years later, the map on 07-08 shows almost no navy blue. And it shows a substantial amount that was selling for between $180,000 and $250,000. So you can really see the market pressure. Next slide. We regularly use a technique called the listening project when we do this work. And the next slide shows one of the listening projects that we did where we people went out in teams of two. I'm sorry, one slide back. People went out in teams of two, and we actually did more than 300 interviews. And we asked questions about, you need to go next slide back. Great, perfect, that's a perfect slide. We asked questions like, what's going on in the neighborhood in terms of the changes? How has vacant land affected you and your family? And we also described a tool that's been used in neighborhoods like ours where there's a lot of vacancy and blight and a lot of market pressure called a community land trust. And the next slide is just a description of what community land trusts are. So there it shows we were trying to put vacant land, both government-owned and ideally tax-delinquent land, and transfer it into an entity, a neighborhood-controlled organization that was a community land trust. And then the community land trust would find developers, or the land trust itself could put all of that land back in use for affordable housing, community facilities, businesses. And the relationship between the structures, which would be owned by families and businesses and nonprofits, and the land was something called a ground lease. And that ground lease ensures affordability and also ensures a decent return when people who own the structure sell those structures. Next slide. So what you do when you ask people questions is report back to them. And the top of this slide shows a report back meeting from our listening project. And there were a lot of folks from the community there. And folks were asking for a deeper understanding of community land trusts. So the bottom slide is from a meeting where we really went through all the pros and cons of creating a land trust in our neighborhood. And it was at that meeting where we decided to create the Community Justice Land Trust. So now we have a land trust, but there's a question about how to get land into our land trust. And it was, you can do the next slide, it was at this time that we started understanding that these problems of vacancy and blight are occurring throughout the city in many, many neighborhoods, as well as many neighborhoods experiencing market pressure. Together groups from around the city to form the campaign to take back vacant land. And this coalition wanted to push the city to create a land bank to address the problem of vacancy and blight, but a land bank that just consolidated land and got it back out only for market rate development without any protections to ensure that there were affordable development wasn't a land bank we could trust. So on the next slide, we spent time talking about our values. And out of those values, created goals that we wanted to make sure that we had in our land trust legislation. So those values are fairness, accountability, and transparency. And the goals really had to do with making sure that there was affordable development that came onto the land out of the land bank, and that there were regular folks on the board, and that we got a really good report about what they did so we could hold them accountable. Next slide. So what do you do when you're trying to get legislation passed? Everyone shows up a lot in city council. There was a real presence in city council, meeting with our elected officials, and also a lot of community education and meetings in communities. Next slide. In addition, we were out in the neighborhood a lot, cleaning up lots. And you're going to see a picture of us cleaning up lots. We just did this every weekend. And then finally, when the legislation was drafted, and we felt that it was good legislation, on the next slide you can see we really wanted to pressure certain council people to support that legislation, get it out of committee, and get it voted on. So we posted vacant lots in their districts where we wanted folks from the neighborhood to call them and make sure that they voted it out of the committee, and voted yes. So in the next slide, you'll see the good news is we won. The bill was passed, and the language to ensure our values and goals we had in the legislation. Oops, so now we need to go to the next slide. And in the next slide takes us back really to the present. And many of the same groups that were part of the campaign to take back vacant land came back together. And we decided that now we'd want a process to get land. We wanted to take the next step and identify allies on council that would push for resources for development on that land, especially in neighborhoods like the one I work in that were experiencing families and businesses getting pushed out. So we formed the Philadelphia Coalition for Affordable Communities, and our campaign is called Development Without Displacement. And as I mentioned, we're working to pass a series of laws that will expand and protect affordability, especially in neighborhoods undergoing gentrification. Next slide. So just like in all of our other work, we pair data with stories, and in this case, we published a document that has stories of families, businesses, and urban farms that have been displaced. Next slide. In our research document, at the heart of the document is the information that in the city of Philadelphia, incomes are stagnant or shrinking, while it's clear that housing costs are on the rise. And the graph shows that citywide, between 2000 and 2012, the median household income fell, that's in orange, while median gross rent and home sale prices in red and brown rose. The report identifies kind of three bubbles or portions of North, South, and West Philly that had the most transactions and that are gentrifying. And we pulled the same statistics for those neighborhoods. And as you can see, between 2000 and 2012, the median gross rent in the neighborhood where I work in North Philly increased 27%, which was practically double the citywide rate of 15%. In terms of the increase in home sale prices, citywide it went up 51% during that period, but in West Philly it increased 98%, in South Philly 184%, and in North Philly 200%, nearly 4 times the citywide rate. Next slide, please. So in addition to identifying where gentrification was occurring, we wanted to look at the changes and what's happening in terms of income and housing. We wanted to identify what is the cost in the community and how's gentrification hurting neighborhoods. And this slide shows one important indicator, the decline in the percentage of African-American households in gentrifying neighborhoods. And the data confirms that people of color are being displaced, changing the racial makeup of our communities. And the graph shows that African-American households decreased in all 3 neighborhoods by at least 20%, while citywide the African-American households increased by 5%. Next slide. So the report also highlights that more households are cost burdened throughout the city, both renters and homeowners. And so we learned in 2000 that 42% of the renters in our city were cost burdened. While you look now in 2012, the most recent data that we have, 52%, so up from 42 to 52. And in 2000, 25%. I'm sorry, those were renters, I was saying, and in 2000, 25% of owners were cost burdened compared to 33% in 2012. And we always instruct our researchers to collect and break down the data by council district, because this really helps us make our case with our elected officials when we as their constituents go in to visit them. Next slide, please. So to us, all this data shows that it's clear that displacement is real, and we know we need to impact citywide policy to try to affect the problem. So our coalition is proposing a package of bills to address displacement and expand affordability. And right now, the pieces that we're looking at are the ones that are listed on this slide. We're looking at anti-speculation legislation, which is really a matter of increasing the realty transfer tax on houses that are bought and sold twice in 2 years, which most people call flipping. So just on houses that sell twice. And if we increase realty transfer tax by 1.5%, it could more than double the current amount that's going into our housing trust fund by adding $12 million every year. Another tool that we're looking at is a housing impact fee, and the research we need to be doing on this, and we're doing it now, is looking at, given all the market rate development that's occurring, that creates a need for affordable housing, because all the people who need to watch people's kids and be their policemen and their teachers and work in the bars, they need affordable housing. So we're looking at the number in terms of the need of affordable housing, and that's called a nexus study. And then we're looking at what kind of a fee could be levied on market rate development, just a cost per square foot that would be directed into the Housing Trust Fund that will definitely not slow down the development of market rate development. The next is just trying to capture tax abatements when the 10-year tax abatement ends, making sure that we're getting a substantial amount of the new taxes into ideally the Housing Trust Fund for affordability. And then we're looking at expanding the use of community land trusts by getting more land into our land trust. And also folks have been coming to us and asking us to work in their communities. My next slide really just shows an example of if we were to get the anti-speculation fee legislation passed, what kind of impact it could have, this new revenue on affordability in Philly. So it shows that we could every year create 240 new units. We could help preserve through home repair grants. We could help folks stay in their homes even if they're in wheelchairs, and help folks who are homeless get into homes. And we're also including urban agriculture in our work because we feel that's important. So this just shows the impact. And then my last slide, next slide, just can give you information on how to get in touch with us if you want to find out more about our campaign or even join the campaign. That's our website. So I think now it's my job to turn it back to Jean for another polling question.
Great, thank you so much, Nora. All right, I will pose that last polling question for those of you who have joined us in the webinar. That polling question should have popped up on your screen, and I'll read that aloud for our participants. Are you currently devising an equitable development strategy for your neighborhood or service area? You have two options with that question. Is it yes or is it no? And while our folks are responding to that polling question, I'm just going to remind you, you can ask questions of our presenters today, and you can ask them anytime during the session. Just click that Ask Question button in the webinar and type your question right in, and we will get that queued up for our presenters at the end of the content portion of this presentation. So I think that was probably long enough for you to decide if it was a yes or a no for you. And I'm going to go ahead and show those results. Hopefully that box will pop up. Okay, it looks like 67% of our participants said no. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Andy.
Great. Thanks, Jean. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, pleased to be able to join Eileen and Nora and you all in this webinar. If we can just go to the next slide, I think we can go to slide 50. LISC, Philadelphia LISC is a local chapter of the national organization. Next slide, please. The Local Initiative Support Corporation is a national community development corporation. This is our goals for today, just to introduce ourselves, to present the data, provide an overview of our engagement process and the strategies going forward. Next slide, please. Can we have slide 52? Thanks. So we've been in existence for 35 years. We work in urban and rural communities throughout the country as a community development intermediary and a community development financial institution, working to assist neighborhood residents with positive community change for the residents and their communities. Next slide, please. Locally, we are one of the oldest of the LISC offices and have been working on communities throughout the city. More intensively, we've worked in parts of West Philadelphia and North Philadelphia in a Sustainable Communities Initiative model that combines strong partnerships with residents and community development corporations like WCRP and government agencies and anchor institutions, trying to work from the ground up towards comprehensive community change to the benefit of residents. Next slide. This is our area that we're talking about today, West Philadelphia. You've seen it on the previous two presentations. It's an area that has been in continuous but not extreme gentrification, according to Eileen's numbers and Nora's presentation. It includes the areas of Mantua, Belmont, West Powelton, and Saunders Park. Next slide, please. The model that we work in this part of West Philadelphia is a collaborative model, cross-sector partnership, using 2 resident-driven plans that were developed in 2011 and 12 as the guideposts, and a collaborative cross-sector partnership to make sure that implementation occurs and that it is accountable to the residents and to the plan. Next slide, please. The concerns that residents expressed coming off of their planning process reflect significant changes and perceptions of changes in their surrounding area that they wanted to make sure were addressed. These issues were touched upon in the 2 community plans, but residents developing the Fair Future strategy wanted to make sure they had a particular set of strategies and partners in place to specifically monitor change and address change and to shape change on behalf of the residents. The issues that they were most concerned about was the growth of University City, which is one of the fastest growing areas of the city, significant anchor institution and related business development. On the one hand, it creates job opportunities. On the other hand, it creates increased demand for student and professional housing, and that's the potential risk of displacing longer-term and lower-income residents. Studentification, this is an area that has more students moving in, driving neighborhood change than necessarily longer-term residents. It's not a neighborhood so far that's seeing significant change in terms of more affluent homeowners. Also, there's a proposed new middle school that would be assisted by Drexel University, one of the partners in the community, and that creates opportunities for improved education, but also fears that that will attract new, more affluent home buyers and homeowners, and that will add to the growth in the student population, further putting pressure on longer-term and lower-income residents. In addition, the city underwent a significant property reassessment called the Actual Valuation Initiative that created anxiety and fear for many lower-income homeowners as well as tenants. And then most recently, in 2014, the area was part of the city's Promise Zone designation, which again created the opportunities for improvement in the neighborhoods, but also risks that the change would be unaccountable and perhaps detrimental to residents. Next slide, please. So these are the initial takeaways from some of the data slides that I'll be sharing, but generally this has been a neighborhood in the past 40 years that has seen a decline in African-American residents, decrease in income and home ownership, increase in young adults related to the growth in students. It's buttressed by a large supply of subsidized affordable housing, but has a highly at-risk home ownership supply for lower-income residents. Next slide, please. This is the study area. There's 4 neighborhoods. The Powelton Village neighborhood is a control neighborhood for the study. It's a neighborhood that had already gentrified, already been pretty well filled up with student housing, but we wanted to use it as a baseline in comparing changes in the other 3 neighborhoods. Next slide. So what we see is that the total area has lost about 1/3 of its population in the previous 40 years. Powelton Village is the one neighborhood that has seen an increase, and some of the other neighborhoods have lost as many as 50% of their residents over 40 years. Next slide. Compared to the city, this has been historically a largely African-American population living in this part of West Philadelphia, but you can see that the decline has been significant, and while it still has a greater proportion that cultural and ethnic historical base in the neighborhood has been eroded and created additional fears about what neighborhood change may mean for residents. Next slide. Incomes have generally tracked the changes of income for the city as a whole, but you can see that even 40 years ago, the incomes were about half of those in the city and continue to be about half of the citywide average income. Next slide. Similarly, we have a much lower homeownership rate than the city as a whole, and the homeownership rate has declined more rapidly than in other parts of the city. Next slide. Sales prices have generally tracked somewhat up along with the citywide average, but you can see that Palatine Village, the comparative neighborhood, has seen the most significant changes. It also has the lowest base of owner-occupied properties, so any change in property values can have a rippling effect more quickly in that neighborhood than in the other neighborhoods that have a stronger home ownership base. Next slide. As I indicated earlier, we have a large supply of publicly subsidized affordable rental housing, and compared to the city as a whole, significantly a greater proportion. So that to some degree, the fear among renters is more whether they're in subsidized unit or not, but those that are in subsidized units are generally more protected than in many other neighborhoods in the city. We don't have any significant numbers of subsidized or preserved affordable home ownership units currently. Next slide, please. And we also have significant vacant property in public ownership, which creates both an opportunity and a threat, as Nora indicated earlier with the land bank. Having accountability and community determination of what happens with publicly owned land in a neighborhood is key to trying to manage development on behalf of resident benefit and not simply on developers. Next slide. And significantly, we have high levels of tax delinquency among our homeowners, so that while the renters are relatively safe with subsidized housing, our homeowners are significantly at risk losing their property due to tax delinquency. Next slide. So this was the data that was shared at the beginning of a 12-month process with residents. It occurred over 9 meetings during the year, 365 residents. We made sure to rotate meetings in different parts of the neighborhood so we could have as many voices as possible. As Nora indicated, there were listening sessions back to the community in this neighborhood, as with her process, and facilitated discussions so that we could try to share the data, but also process what residents were seeing and believing was happening, and also then leading to what they believed were the priority actions to take in light of the data and in light of the changes going on in the neighborhood and around them. Next slide. We worked with a set of resident stakeholders as well as outside consultants to share best practices as well as the data so that residents could then determine what had worked or not worked in other neighborhoods and whether they believed that that was applicable to their situation here. Next slide. So the key strategies that residents and their partners identified for moving forward to try to address concerns were increasing and preserving home ownership, connecting residents to the growing number of jobs that are in and around the neighborhood, preserving neighborhood identity and culture, making sure that as change occurs, it really is as much as possible reflective of the history of the neighborhood, and then having a broader agenda for investment and opportunity, improving schools for everyone, and making sure that vacant land is developed for community benefit. Next slide. So now we'll be moving into implementation mode with multiple partners trying to link as much as possible to the engines of growth in the neighborhood, but hold them accountable to residents and make sure that we raise outside funds and resources that residents can help control so that they can determine the future of the neighborhood. Next slide. I want to thank you. I want to make sure we left times for questions. I want to hand it back over to Jean. It's been my pleasure to share this information, the ongoing efforts of our partners in West Philadelphia.
All right, thanks so much, Andy. And thank you to all of our presenters for presenting your content today. We did get a handful of questions that I will announce in just a second. I want to remind our participants they can still ask questions. If you've joined us in the webinar, you can just click that Ask Question button and type your question right in there, and I will announce them for the presenters. Okay, our first question. What is your strategy for dealing with slumlords who take advantage of increased neighborhood housing values by refusing to maintain or repair units occupied by low-income renters, and then jacking up rent in order to accelerate evictions? Shouldn't an effort to survey and organize tenants affected by the above scenarios be part of the solution?
This is Nora, and I think it definitely needs to be part of the solution. You know, and there are some, in many cities, renters are coming together to organize, you know, depending on the circumstances in the neighborhood. But, you know, we have a local tenants organization, TURN, that is also a really good resource.
And this is Andy, and I would just add, I think, you know, it's a combination of carrot and stick always. Need to try to put protections in place for tenants, but also, particularly for smaller landlords, you need to try to make sure you give them the resources they need so that they can be good landlords and keep up their properties while also renting to lower income residents.
Okay, thank you.
I think those are both great responses, and I would just add that a lot of times you see some of the most egregious rental housing conditions in low-income neighborhoods that are not gentrifying. So it's important to keep in mind kind of the broader rental housing market, even beyond these gentrifying neighborhoods.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, our next question. Who can help set up a DCLT in different areas of the city?
I think the question was for me. This is Nora. In learning more about community land trusts, I'm glad to talk to anyone who wants to learn about it. I mean, it takes work to set up your own CLT and resources, so I just want to caution, but it can really be worth it. So if people got my information on the slide, if not, just Google Women's Community Revitalization Project, and you'll be able to get me on our website. I'm glad to talk about that. We work with a consultant called John Davis, who's worked with almost all of the land trusts in the country, and he's really good. So we can connect you with him, too.
All right, thank you, Nora. It looks like this question is for Andy. What percentage of renters with subsidized rents receive Section 8 vouchers? Couldn't landlords decide to no longer accept these vouchers once they realize that they can either sell the property or rent it to someone who could afford a higher rent?
So for most of the units that we included in the publicly subsidized group in our slides, those are long-term subsidies that the landlords agree to maintain those units for some number of years. It's not tenant-driven vouchers where a landlord might choose to accept or not accept. It is true that none of them are permanently preserved, but there are multi-year contracts in place. The other answer is that a number of the owners of those properties are nonprofits, community development corporations with a public benefit mission. So a number of those units are unlikely to turn over as long as those organizations maintain themselves. And then finally, the largest number are owned by the Public Housing Authority, whose, again, public mission is to maintain them as affordable housing.
And this is Nora. I just want to speak for our neighborhood, and what we've seen is that is a really great question, because we're seeing landlords who are renting to Section 8 tenants selling left and right. People are getting pushed out. So maybe it differs in different neighborhoods, but I think renters are really the most at risk with these gentrifying neighborhoods, so it's really important to look at that.
All right, thanks for those responses. We do have a couple of questions still in the queue, but just if you have a question, please click that Ask Question button, type it in there, and I can get that queued up for our presenters. So please do that. Our next question: is housing, by means of increasing affordable housing opportunities through CLT or other methods, the only solution to helping longer-term residents benefit from an improved neighborhood? What about education, jobs, financial literacy programs, etc.?
This is Andy. Certainly, we think that need all of those tools. Some residents, we have a significant number of senior citizen retired homeowners. They need particular assistance to be able to stay in their homes. We have other residents, increasing numbers, who are more of working age but don't necessarily have stable employment. So part of this, again, I think, is linking residents to economic opportunities where they can improve their incomes and wealth, but also making sure that we have public policy mechanisms and tools in place so that somebody isn't displaced because they're not able to increase their income.
Yeah, I would really agree that all of these things are critically important. They're all connected, but housing is foundational. And if you don't have enough money to afford your house, you need to leave. And so, it's very, very hard if you're struggling with housing to deal with work and kids and health and all the other important things.
Okay, thank you. Our next question: are there opportunities for the gentrifiers to work collaboratively with long-term residents on neighborhood improvement, or are their interests too much at odds?
I just want to say, this is Nora, that we believe that everyone should be welcome in a neighborhood, and we don't like to be kept out or pushed out, and we definitely want to welcome new residents in, and we feel like we have a lot in common. They want to be in our neighborhoods because they're really strong and because they're diverse. So I think there are opportunities for folks who are open to it, new residents, to come and work together on these issues. And I've seen a number of people who have gotten involved. So in our lot cleanups and in our work to make sure that we get rid of vacant land, there were a lot of new residents who were part of it. But I think when it comes down to it, the people who are really suffering the most are the ones who are going to be the most motivated to make change. So we need to be able to include both folks. It's not going to be just new residents. It needs to be a combination. And those folks who are losing their housing are key in terms of determining what kind of work we do on this.
And I totally agree with what Nora said, and I would just say that often, intentionally or unintentionally, public policy gives advantages to people coming into a neighborhood, and they may not even recognize that they are potentially part of driving somebody else out. So I think it's important to always raise up, where possible, the public policy solutions that allow new residents to come into a neighborhood, allow developers to develop without displacing long-term and lower-income residents.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question: where can I find the research from the Fed on gentrification? Is that something that practitioners can use?
I guess I will take that one. So it's up on the Community Development Studies and Education Department website right now. So the Philadelphia Fed's Community Development Studies and Education Department. There's a link to the full discussion paper on the front page for the website, but actually if you go to the publications section and select discussion papers, you'll see both the discussion paper and the kind of more user-friendly practitioner summary that we developed that includes kind of distilled major lessons from the discussion paper, as well as the analyses for those specific neighborhood clusters. So for West Philadelphia, South Philadelphia, Center City, Lower Northeast, and the river wards.
Okay, thanks, Eileen. We do have a couple of questions left. I know that we've reached our time, but I just want to see if we can get one or two questions in before we part ways today. So the question is, you need real estate investors to help renovate properties and build on land. Since these investors are in business to make money, how do you balance their need to make money with keeping sales prices down or rents down?
We have spent a lot of time, again, this is Nora, thinking about the market and thinking about market rate development and wanting to ensure that it continues. But if you do speak to most developers, including market rate developers, you'll tell you their work is so hard, their profit margin is so low. So I think you need to get accurate data to see what policies we're trying to pass and how will they actually affect the developers. So I think we're really talking, our target audience is the elected officials who can pass these policies, and we need to make sure that we're also in conversation with the building industry to make sure that we're really clear about what the pressures and their context is. I don't know if that's a good answer to the question, but I feel like the developers are not going to say yes to any of this on their own. We have to get our elected officials to say, yes, this is good, balanced policy. But we need to make sure that we're not hurting development.
Okay, thanks. I'm just going to squeeze this last question in before we part. This question is for Nora. First off, thank you for your commitment to serving vulnerable communities. You mentioned urban agriculture. Greening programs have many benefits ranging from stormwater management to increasing land value. In regards to land value, can this accelerate gentrification or increase gentrifiable land?
I think we need to make sure that urban agriculture, farms, gardens, open space cannot be used for market rate development, and we need to ensure that it continues for those uses. They're just tremendously important for neighborhoods, and so I think that sometimes people can see any land that they perceive as vacant, which includes open space and urban ag, and think it's ripe for development. So we just need to stay vigilant and work on that.
Okay, thanks so much, Nora, for that response. We are 2 minutes past our time, so I am going to go ahead and close out our call today. I'd like to thank our participants for joining us, and a very special thank you to our presenters for their time. You may have seen our survey pop up on your screen if you joined us in the webinar. You can take that now, or you can take the survey when we send it to you via email. Either way, you only have to fill it out once, and we certainly do appreciate any and all feedback. This concludes our webinar today. Have a great day.